just give us a chance to talk to you and to get to know you. Thank you so much to David and Ralph for covering for me the past 2 Sundays so that I could be with Melinda as she was giving birth. Thank you so much for that. It's good to be back. I'm glad to be back up here. We are going to continue with our series on the spiritual disciplines. Timing, of course, as God likes to do, it works out great. This morning, we're going to be talking about our next spiritual discipline, which is still in the private realm, which is fasting. Now, as we start talking about fasting, it's really something that's not that commonly talked about. It's not something that's commonly practiced, definitely in America. However, there is something that's more common that we're going to start with this morning to kind of illustrate a point, and that's Lent. If you didn't know, that's going on right now. It started on March 6th with Ash Wednesday, and it goes on for 40 days leading up to Easter. And if you do the math, you realize the 40 days, there's a little gap there. Well, that's because the 6 Sundays in those weeks don't count. But basically, that's something that other Christians, other people, and maybe you're doing this, do as a way to prepare themselves for Easter. And typically, the 40 days is thought to kind of coincide with Jesus fasting for 40 days in the wilderness. And that's where they get the idea from, and they lead that up to Easter as a way to prepare themselves for Easter. Now, if you've talked to people who've done Lent in the past, not all of them do 40 days worth of fasting. And in fact, I would say probably very, very few. But typically, people fast for short periods of time, or they choose to give up something for Lent. And that's where I want to start this morning. I want to talk about this because I think it's going to illustrate a good point. So when you think about somebody, or maybe you did this, when you give up things for Lent, what kind of things come to your mind that people give up? Well, maybe some people give up chocolate, maybe sodas, maybe Facebook, something like that. Or, I've even heard people that tend to give up drugs or alcohol or even swearing. Now, towards the end here, you see a little something that's weird about it, but I want you to think about even the chocolate. Okay, why do some people choose to give up chocolate? Well, maybe because they want to be skinnier, right? Maybe they're trying to lose weight. Maybe that's the reason for giving up chocolate or sodas. You think about the idea of giving up social media, right? If somebody chooses to give up social media, what's the motivation behind that? Well, maybe it's just to be more productive. Or with that last thing, giving up something like swearing or drugs or alcohol, really, that's something that they should have given up a long time ago anyway. So you see, and you got to dig deeper and talk to the people that are doing this. Just because they're observing Lent doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it the right way, or that really they're even truly observing Lent. Choosing to give up something doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving up or that they're doing Lent. And that's the point I want to illustrate, is that similar to Lent, fasting is the exact same way. So you think about fasting, it's the idea of giving up food. Really, most of us have done this in one form or another. Right? How many of you have had to have blood work done? And they told you can't eat from midnight until whenever the blood work is. Right? And I remember the craziest thing is somebody showed up to the men's prayer breakfast having to have blood work that day. And I was thinking, you came to all this biscuits and gravy and sausage and you got blood work? But Lance did a good job. He held it out. But just because you're not giving, or that you're giving up food doesn't necessarily mean you're fasting. And one more example, maybe you're in the airport and you look around at the prices of things, and for that point in time you're thinking, you know what, I just won't eat for a while, right? Just because we give up food doesn't necessarily mean that we're fasting. So this morning, if you've been here and you've been listening to me for a couple of months now, I just recently did a sermon on fasting. That one was geared more to just answer all the questions that we have. Fasting being so uncommon, it's really something that's not talked about. It's not something that we even think about. So if fasting is completely new to you, go to our YouTube channel and look that up and you can find it. But this morning, what I want to do is I want to make sure that if we choose to fast, if we move forward and we set out to carry out a fast, that we do it the right way. That we're not just not eating, but instead we're truly fasting in a way that honors God and helps us to grow closer to Him. Now, before we dive in deep, I want you to look at this. This is from the book that we're pulling from, if you don't know where this is, most of this is coming from a book called Celebration of Discipline. But in here, he's got these journal of somebody that set out to fast one day a week for 2 years. And they just write down, every time that they fast, write down thoughts about how that went. And I want you just to see the progression of these journal entries as we go through. So the first one, the person said it felt great, or it felt a great accomplishment to go a whole day without food. I congratulated myself on the fact that I found it so easy. The second one, began to see that the above was hardly the goal of fasting. I was helped in this by the beginning to feel hunger. Third day, it says I began to relate the food fast to other areas of my life where I was more compulsive. I didn't have to have a seat on the bus to be contented, or to be cool in the summer or warm when it was cold. Fourth entry, I reflected more on Christ's suffering and the suffering of those who are hungry and who have hungry babies. Fifth entry, 6 months after beginning the fast discipline, I began to see why a 2-year period was suggested. The experience changed along the way. Hunger on fast days became more acute, and the temptation to eat was even stronger. For the first time, I was using the day to find God's will for my life and began to think about what it meant to surrender one's life. And then the sixth one, I now know that prayer and fasting must be intricately bound together. There is no other way, and yet that way is not yet combined in me. See, as you can see, if you're going to set out to carry out fast in your life, your experience is going to be similar to this. The first time, you're going to be just glad that you made it through the 24 hours. But as you start to, this becomes a natural thing, it's going to change. And you're going to start to see different things and experience different things. And through this tool, through this discipline, just like the others, we can grow in our faith and our trust in God. So this morning, I'm going to give you what I consider to be the starter's pack for fasting. You know, having done this myself several times and thinking about it, I wanted to give you some quick, easy things to help you get started along this way. If there was ever a day where you should take notes, today is the day, okay? I'm not going to repeat it. If you need to go back to YouTube and see it later, you know, whatever, I strongly encourage you to take notes. So the first, we're going to start with how to. And the first thing I want to show you is 3 key aspects of a true God-honoring fast. You know, we started off, we're saying not eating doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing a fast. So I want to give you the 3 keys that really separate the difference between just not eating and doing something that's going to really help you grow closer to God and to honor Him. These are attitudes, outcomes, and mindsets that we're supposed to have. The first is that a fast should worship God and not ourselves. A fast should worship God and not ourselves. We're going to see this in some of our later verses, but fasting is something that was regularly done as an act of worship. But I want you to see this here in Matthew chapter 6, verse 16 starting. It says, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." You know, I really hope this is the reason fasting is not talked about that much. I hope that most people read this and you've been practicing fasting and really you just kept it to yourself. But see, fasting can quickly become something where you start to pat yourself on the back. Fasting can become something, unlike any other discipline, where you quickly start to brag about, hey, I went this far, and you start to look it up, and you start to look at the health benefits, and you can quickly get sidetracked as to, man, fasting is really just such a good thing for me. Look at this. But ultimately, fasting is to be a worship to God. It's supposed to be something between you and Him, something that's meant to bring glory and honor to Him. And I think that's one of the major keys to having a God-honoring fast. The second is that a fast should humble us. Psalm 69, one of the Psalms of David, he says, "When I wept and humbled my soul with fasting, it became my reproach." See, if fasting is something that leads you to build yourself up, something like that first entry where you feel better about yourself because of it, that's great. That's fine. That's okay. But ultimately, it should be about humbling ourselves before God. It should be something that reminds us of our fragility, that reminds us that our bodies are temporary, that reminds us that even though our body demands food, that can itself be a lie. Fasting should humble us. The third thing is the fast should be aligning us with God's will, not trying to bend God's will to ours. Isaiah chapter 58, starting in verse 3, says, "Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure and you oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is such a fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Is this not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and to not hide yourself from your own flesh." See, if we're going to truly fast and just not eat, there's three things that it has to be. Is one, we have to be worshiping God through our fast and not ourselves. The second is that a fast should humble us. And the third is that a fast should be aligning us with God's will and not trying to align God's will with ours. Now, that's the three keys. The next thing I want to share with you is 3 practical tips. If you're truly going to fast, no matter what, with this being such a strange thing to most people, I couldn't go on without sharing with you some tips that's going to make this easier. Similar to running a marathon, if you tried to start tomorrow and fast for 7 days straight, it'd be impossible. Your body's just not acclimated to it. In fact, you could probably do a lot of damage to your body by trying to put it through such an extreme shock. So I want to give you 3 tips that I think will make this easier for you. The first is to buddy up. Don't do it alone. If you're going to fast, if it's your first time doing this, find a person or two and do it together. No matter what, the encouragement from that alone is going to be enough to where you have somebody to talk with. You can share experiences. Even some of the stuff I'm going to say in a second, this could be talked about with your buddy and figure out how is the best way to go about the physical part and the spiritual part of fasting. So buddy up. The second thing, start small. 24 hours, I think, is kind of the standard way to fast. If you want to fast, that's the one you should aim for. But before you start with a 24-hour, start with just one meal. That sounds crazy. To live in a country like this where there's so much food, there's places all over the world where missing a meal, they would laugh at the fact that I'm having to ask you to miss a meal. But instead, we're not used to that. Most of us, we feel it. In fact, back when I was doing youth ministry, if lunch was 30 minutes late, you heard about how starving everybody was. Skipping one meal is something that's really just not that common to us. If you don't want to start with skipping, there's something else you can do that would help. And this is what I did, and it helped the transition so much easier. Instead of skipping a meal, just replace that meal with a juice. Replace that with V8 or replace that with apple juice or something simple like that. And just do that for your first time. And just try that for one meal. And then after your body acclimates to one meal, do 2. And I'm here to tell you that if you hadn't sat down and thought about this, if you hadn't done the math, 24 hours of fast is not skipping breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Because if you do the math on that, if you eat the dinner before and then don't eat till the breakfast after, that's actually 36 hours. Skipping 3 meals is 36 hours without food. However, the easiest one to do is to skip dinner one night and breakfast the next, and to have lunch after that. So start out, if you're going to do this, start out one night and just replace your dinner with juice. And see how that goes. Do that for a week or 2. And then after that, replace your dinner and your breakfast with juice. And see how that goes. And then when you're ready, nothing altogether, just water. Now, not everyone is going to have a smooth, perfect little experience to going 24 hours without food. And in fact, maybe because of a medical condition, this may not be something that your doctor would even recommend. So if you're worried about this, if you're thinking, your first time skipping a meal, I just don't feel right, something's not right, see a doctor. Don't let this, back where we started with the disciplines at the beginning, this is not some legalistic thing that you have to do. Instead, this is a grace given to us by God so that we can experience Him more deeply. Do not let this become something that hurts your body physically. Our bodies can do this. Our bodies were created to be able to go long times without food. We just have to retrain it to get back to that. The third thing, keep your purpose clear. First, you need to buddy up. Second, you start small. But the third thing is that if you're going to do this, keep your purpose clear. Think about, it really relates to running in a lot of ways in this. If you were going to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to run 5 miles. It's easy to start running 5 miles, right? You know what, I'm just going to go and I'm going to run for 5 miles. And you get to running, and man, mile 1, whew, okay, that wasn't bad. Mile 2, all right, that's a little tougher. 3, 4, and between 4 and 5, that's where people tend to give up. And it's the same thing with choosing to fast. You could start at lunch on a Saturday and you can say, all right, you know what, I'm going to fast for the next 24 hours. And you're like, hey, this is easy for 2, 3, 4 o'clock. But then when 5 or 6 o'clock hits and everybody around you's eating, or maybe, somebody, it may not even be your family, maybe you just drive by a billboard or a commercial comes on and your mouth starts to water. And you're thinking, oh, you know what, I'll do it next week, right? It's easy to start the fast, but to stay with it, to go through those hunger pains, to deny your body the thing that it's trying to tell you that you need, that's when you're going to need purpose. That's when you're going to need a reason to do it and not just, you know what, I feel like doing this today. So keep your purpose clear. Now, we're going to end with the why. Some of y'all that read these books and start with the why, I'm sorry, it's coming at the end today. But I want to give you 3 reasons, 3 purposes. If you're truly going to fast, it's not just trying to get through 24 hours without eating. Right, we talked about that. Not eating does not equal a fast. But instead, your reason for the fast. This is why you would do it. This is the thing that you're setting out to accomplish in this 24 hours. And I want to give you 3. Now, there's going to be lots. And in fact, if you start to look through Scripture, it's just like any other discipline. It can be used for so many different things. And in fact, there's probably at least 8, 9, 10 different ones in Scripture alone. But I want to give you 3 reasons that are a good place to start if you're going to look to fast. The first one is you fast to listen to God. If you're going to fast, this is a great place to start. You fast to more intently listen to God. Acts chapter 13. Most of the New Testament, or books-wise, number-wise, was written by Paul. And we know about Paul's missionary journeys and all the different places he go. In fact, just look in the New Testament, and most of those places, Paul went. But yet, the start of Paul's missionary journey is right here in Acts chapter 13. He's with the church here in Antioch, and it says, now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called the Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Now while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. Then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. See, for the first apostles and disciples, fasting was so common to them, this just came naturally. As they're at Antioch, they're fasting and they're worshiping. And we don't know. Maybe there was a need. Maybe they wanted to send somebody out. Maybe the Holy Spirit just completely worked this along Himself. But nonetheless, what we see is while they were worshiping God with fasting and prayer, they were able to hear the Spirit's calling. They were able to see that the Spirit was leading Barnabas and Saul to go out and to send them to be a missionary in these other places. See, the first possible purpose that we could have is to fast in order to listen to God's Spirit, to listen to Him more intently. The second is a fast to long for God. Luke chapter 2, we're told of this prophetess, Anna. It says she was the daughter of Phanuel, the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Let's assume that she got married, say around 14, 16, somewhere in there. She lived with her husband for 7 years, so at about the age of 21, I didn't do my math right. No, that's right, 21. 21, 23, somewhere in there. She's a widow. Now, most of us would say, man, her life's just beginning, right? Life expectancy is a little shorter then, nonetheless, but she definitely had plenty of time to possibly go out to look to remarry. Maybe there wasn't brothers, maybe there's something, we don't know that. But what we do know is she chose not to get remarried. And she lived the rest of her life as a widow. Now, that in itself is interesting, and we could stop and we could think about that for a while, but I want you to see what we're told about this lady in the end of 37 here. It says, she did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. You know, I can't help but think her relationship with God was such that when her husband died, she was content with having God. She was content with not needing to remarry. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to follow this. I don't know exactly what was going on. Maybe the gift was given to her before. It's all very confusing, but through fasting and prayer and worship, she lived the majority of her life. What does she have to look forward to? Without remarrying, most of us would say, well, nothing, right? But instead, she saw worshiping God as a way to look forward as to what was to come. Maybe she wasn't able to. Let's think down that route for again. Maybe there wasn't siblings or whatever the reason was. Maybe she just was relegated to this kind of lifestyle. At the end of her life, she had become okay with it. She'd become okay with it to the fact to where she spent all of her time focusing on the thing that she looked forward to. Maybe she wasn't able to find a husband. Regardless, whatever the situation was her being widowed and why she stayed widowed, she became content with God. She became content with seeking Him, with looking forward as to what was to come. Even if we have all these things, even if we're blessed in so many ways, even if we have everything this world can offer, if we truly understand what lies ahead, don't we look forward to what's ahead? Regardless of our situation, regardless if we're married with children, regardless if we have plenty of physical things, if we have friends or power or fame or whatever this world has to offer, no matter what's greater for the person that follows God lies ahead. And fasting is a way that we can worship through this and see it as a way to look forward as to what is to come. We don't know all of Anna's story, but what we know is that she was content with God. She was content with seeking out Him. And we see here in verse 38 that she actually plays a major part in setting out that Jesus is the Messiah. It says, in coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of Him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. She got to see Jesus as a baby in the temple. She got to tell everyone, here is the hope that we've been waiting for. She had been looking ahead so long to that day, and for such energy, and it really all of her time, it says, was spent looking forward to that day. She got to see the Messiah in the flesh. She got to see a taste of what it's like to be with God through Jesus. Fasting is a way that we can long for God, to long for that day when He returns and He brings us home to spend eternity with Him forever. Fasting is a way that we can long for God. And then finally, we can fast to request of God. In the book of Esther, starting in verse 15 of chapter 4, Esther, she wins this beauty contest, essentially is what it is. And she's now the king's, one of his wives, I'm assuming. And she's a Jew, and she's in exile here, and she's in a situation where the pressure starts to come down. And if you've read this story, there's a lot of trickery involved and stuff, but essentially they're wanting to kill all the Jews. They're wanting to do everything they can to push them out, to squeeze them out. And yet she is in the royal court. And she has this conversation with Mordecai, and Mordecai tells her, and he says, maybe God put you in the royal court for this moment. Maybe he put you there so that you could actually do something. And that sounds great on the surface, but the main thing we don't often realize is that just by entering his presence, she could have died. She could have been killed just by coming in at a time when he didn't want her there. If he was angry that day, if he was in a bad mood, Esther's life is over. But Mordecai says, you need to go and you need to do something. You need to go and stand up to the king and tell him not to carry out this sentence for the Jews, not to carry out this that's going to make life so terrible for us. And so she replies to Mordecai in verse 15, says, Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go into the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Esther had this thing coming up where literally it could have meant her life. She could have been killed. She could have been put away. She could have been thrown out of the court. There's all different kinds of things, but most of them could have been bad. And so she goes to Mordecai and she says, Mordecai, gather up all the Jews and fast for 3 days. And the unwritten assumption here is that they're also praying, that they're going to God and they're saying, God, help this to work out for us. Help this to be to where Esther can actually affect the king. Help it to be where Esther does not die. Make this to turn out for good. Now remember back, I talked about one of the keys. This sounds like that Esther and the Jews are trying to bend God to their will. It sounds like that, but I want you to see the end of verse 16. She says, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. See, Esther wasn't just trying to bend God's will to hers. This wasn't selfishly motivated. Esther realized that if she was going to request of God, she had to humble herself. She had to put God first. And she had to realize that ultimately God's will is the one that needs to take place. And with that, they fasted and they prayed and they asked God to bless them. This is something we can do today. As long as we remember our keys, as long as we remember the part that makes this a God-honoring fast, we can go to God through fasting and prayer and say, God, please bless me in this thing. God, I have this thing coming up. I need you to walk me through this. God, I don't know what to do right now. I'm lost. I need your help and your guidance. Fasting can be a tool that we use to make our requests known to God, if we just remember our keys. So our 3 purposes: we can fast to listen to God, we can fast to long for God, and we can fast to request of God. Now, back to the practical tips. I said to buddy up. Well, we're actually planning something, Clark and I, to make this easier for you. So April 27th, that's a Saturday. Mark your calendars for this. April 27th from noon on the Saturday until noon on Sunday. Anybody that wants to fast, we're going to have a fast. Clark and I and anybody else that wants to. We're going to try to do stuff to talk you through this, to help you through this. We're going to put out stuff maybe through text or through Facebook to encouragement around dinner time, because I know that's when you're going to need it, right? We're going to do this together. For anybody that's willing to try this out, we're going to do this April 27th. Now, I could have said next week, but remember, I want you to start small. I want you to take it one step at a time. So I'm giving everybody a month. You got a month, okay? Skip 1 meal. Replace it with juice, and then skip 2. And then on April the 27th, we're going to all do it together. Now, the reason I stopped on this slide is because I want you to pick one of these 3 purposes. If you're going to do this on April 27th or leading up to this, if you're going to practice this, I want you to pick one of these 3. And I want this to be your focus on April the 27th. Because what did I say? You got to keep your purpose clear. I don't want you just to not eat. Right? I'm not just, hey, torture yourself by watching other people eat. That's not what I'm going for. But instead, I want you to pick one of these 3. And I want you on April 27th to be the first time that we together as a church collectively fast. for one of these three purposes. Now, April the 28th, that Sunday at noon, we're going to have a potluck. However, be careful what you bring. Do not bring ribs. Do not bring all those delicious things that we normally, with lots of fats and grease and all that kind of stuff. Because what you eat after coming off of a fast is very key, right? We don't want a collective fast followed by collective vomiting, right? That's not what we're going for. So on April the 28th, we're going to have a potluck. Soups, vegetables, fruits, breads, simple breads, mind you. All of those things are okay for that potluck, all right? If you haven't done this before, you can look it up. There's plenty of information. But we will have a potluck. Just careful what you bring, okay? We are going to post a sign up so that we can all know who's doing it together and like I say, do it collectively. This is why I said take notes. Because a month from now, we're going to do this together. And I want you to be very clear on one of these three purposes for that day. All right? I hope that after this lesson, it may not have been the most exciting material, but I hope that fasting feels like a possibility for you. I hope this feels like something not just that we read about 2,000 years ago, but instead something that we can do today as a way to draw closer to God, as something that we can do to honor God and to worship Him. Now, if you're not a Christian, there's something else you can do that will worship God, that will humble yourselves, and that will align yourselves with God's will. And that's to put Him on in baptism. If you're here and you're not a Christian, that is the first thing. You've probably heard this before. Getting dunked in water is not baptism, right? Otherwise, all of us when we were kids, when we wrestled in the pool, we would have all been baptized already. Baptism is the same way as fasting. It's the same as Lent. Unless you do it with those aspects, with those mindsets, it's just getting wet. But if you're here and you're a Christian, and you're not a Christian, you're ready to turn your life over to God, you're ready to start living for Him, to die to yourself, to put Him on in baptism, raised anew in Christ Jesus, we'd love for you to start that today. Or if you're here and you're a Christian, you need the prayers of the church, just come now as we stand together and sing.